This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends collection. This interview was originally conducted on the 25th of February, 1971. The interview was conducted by Mrs. Maydelle Jones. That's capital Maydell Jones. The interviewee is Mr. Alfred Enoch Aaronson. That's capital Aaronson of Tulsa, Oklahoma. This material is being re-recorded on the 29th of October, 1986 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
This is Mrs. Mac Jones interviewing Mr. Alfred Enoch Aaronson of Tulsa, February the 25th, 1971. Mr. Aaronson, there are many, many things you can tell us to start with. So let's start right with when you were born and when you came to Tulsa.
Well, until 1913, I lived in New York City, having been born October 31st, 1893, on Henry Street in New York City. Because of reverses in business experienced by my father in the Panic of 1907, I found it necessary to earn a living before finishing my school and college education. I had a position in an export department of a large cotton converting concern, taking courses in Columbia University Night School in cotton converting and also in Spanish. I recall a conversation with one of our South American customers who asked me in Spanish if I had an interest in the company. I facetiously answered I didn't have an interest until recently when my boss told me if I didn't take an interest, he would fire me. At this time, I was 19 and busily engaged in developing a career for myself. My older sister, Dion, married an oil man who was moving his oil business from Ohio to Tulsa, Oklahoma, which city was in the first stages of development as an important oil community. My sister Dion feared the Wild West and the stories she heard about cowboys and Indians, and wanted me, her brother, to join her and her husband in this Western venture. My love for her and the great outdoors convinced me to make this move, which I have never regretted. I must admit, our thinking then was to make a lot of money in a few years and return to live in the civilized East. Anyone familiar with the excessive heat of Oklahoma in the summertime, before the advent of exhaust fans and air conditioning, knows it took but little encouragement to convince us to spend the long hot summers either at the seashore in Long Branch or Atlantic City in New York, or the Catskill Mountains, also in New York, the only mountains we then knew about. That is how I met my Millicent, who, having just finished her college education at Barnard College, which is Columbia University, was summering with her parents in the village of Fleischmann, Catskill Mountains, New York. The first day I met her, I proposed marriage, and 6 weeks later we were married.
I call that a fast worker.
Well, if you met my wife, you'd realize why.
I'm sure.
My parents knew her husband, her family, and encouraged this union. My father told me a story that when I was 6 years old, he would take me to services on the Sabbath, and on the way to the synagogue, we would pass beautiful Millicent, then about 5 years old, sitting on the stone steps of her home, smiling sweetly. I invited some of our Oklahoma friends to our wedding. Millicent asked one of them what kind of a place Oklahoma was. And he replied, "Well, I'll tell you, ma'am, Oklahoma is great for men, but it's hell on women and horses." My brother-in-law, who married my older sister, Sylvia, suggested we spend our honeymoon in Old Point Comfort, Virginia, the home of Fortress Monroe, and that we go there by boat from New York Harbor. He told me to be sure to tip the head waiter when we arrived. This would ensure preference attention. Both of us were terribly seasick on the boat, and when I tipped the head waiter, as directed, he gave us a table in the part of the dining room jutting out into the water, which kept us seasick for our entire stay. I was too bashful or dumb to suggest some other table away from the sea. In those days, the hotel in Old Point Comfort had horse-drawn, handsome cabs, which could be hired for rides into the countryside. I asked the black driver where we could go, and he suggested Phoebus, a village a few miles from our hotel. When we arrived at this thoroughly uninteresting and impoverished and very small community, I asked if there was not some other place we could go where they had flowers and interesting scenery. He said, sure. He would take us to Arlington Cemetery, where there was plenty of flowers. We later discovered that in order to see the ocean, we must get a Navy permit to walk through Fortress Monroe. We did this for several days, until we were informed by an officer that the path we took was through a rifle range. We then decided to spend the rest of our honeymoon in Washington, D.C. This we thoroughly enjoyed. One of my friends is now studying psychology and informs me that patterns of life are formed during a very early age. I recall vividly several incidents which may throw some light on the character of my wonderful mother. I was the only son in a family of 5 children. 3 of my sisters were older and 1 sister younger than I. Mother employed an Irish maid who helped to keep house. We lived in an apartment house in New York City on 123rd Street, between Amsterdam and Broadway. In those days, about the year 1905, it was a common occurrence for panhandlers and beggars to come to the door begging for alms. One day, when we were eating lunch, our maid reported to Mother that a beggar was at the desk, at the door, asking for alms and for help. But she volunteered she would not give him anything, as his breath smelled of whiskey. My mother took a coin from her purse and said, "Mary, give him this. Maybe he will buy bread with it this time." Then my mother said to us, if there were no charlatans begging alms, how could anyone eat anything in peace? Food would stick in our throats and choke us. Years later, after my parents came to live in Oklahoma, another incident took place that throws light on Mother's character. We were dealing with a large independent oil firm made up of several partners, one of whom was reported to be worth several $1 million. His partner kidded him in my presence about his fear that he was sure he was going to die in a poorhouse. I told this story at the dinner table one night, and my mother said to me, "Alfred, if I had such fears in Ralph's money, I believe I would build poorhouses so wonderful that if I had to die in them, they would be perfectly lovely places." We children were also blessed with a remarkable father. Father was the oldest child in a family of 10. He and his father were in business together. My grandfather came to America when my father was 6 years old and started to make a living putting a pack on his shoulder and going out peddling. Much later, he became president of a synagogue in New York. He employed my mother's father as the rabbi of the synagogue. My mother's father used to receive letters from his daughter, who was my mother, in Hebrew, and show those letters to my father's father. And he, in turn, would show them to his son Lionel. When my mother finally came to New York, one of the first persons she met was my father. They conversed in Hebrew, the only language they both knew, which permitted them to communicate together. My mother spoke Russian, German, and Hebrew. My father, English and Hebrew. They were soon happily married and remained happily married until the death of my father in 1924, when he was 60 years old. I do not remember ever seeing my mother's parents, who must have left for Palestine before the year 1900. Several years later, my father decided he also wanted to spend, my father's father rather decided, he also, turn it off a minute.
Yeah.
My father's father decided he also wanted to spend the last days in Jerusalem. When he first broached the subject to his wife, she asked him to delay going, as she was reluctant to leave her two young children, a boy of 14 and a girl of 18. She kept putting him off until one day my father received a letter from his father, which in substance said, "I have left for Jerusalem. If you like, send Mama and the children." This they did, and of course the burden of supporting this family rested entirely on my father. He assumed this obligation without complaint during their entire lifetime, and to add to his burden, my father provided the major support for the rest of the family. The result was bankruptcy of his business during a trying period, economic period in the history of this country, 1907, and an indebtedness of about $46,000, which he could not pay. After my father came to Oklahoma and was successful, one of the first things he did was to pay every creditor every cent he owed them, even though there was no legal obligation for him to do so. Years later, our oldest daughter, Grace, met one of those creditors who, when he discovered her antecedents, told her the story of repayment and said, "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." When I came to Tulsa in 1913, Tulsa had a population of approximately 33,000 people. The Robinson Hotel was the big hotel of the city. And then we were so proud of Tulsa Hotel that was built around 1915, I think. Maybe sooner, maybe before that time. I can remember the post office on Boulder Street, which was built in 1917, and how proud we were of that building. And the old courthouse on 6th and Boulder, which was built 2 years before we came to that city.
Were the streets paved then?
The streets were not paved, and the fact of the matter is, when we went to the post office, it was on wooden boards, and before it moved to the Boulder location. The Mayo building, which was built in 1908 as a 5-story building, and later was expanded to a 10-story building in 1910, as I remember. And then the Old Lady of Brady, the theater that we now are so unhappy with in Tulsa and wish we could replace with a real and beautiful theater. was built in 1914, a year after I came to Tulsa. And we thought it was magnificent at that time. Then the movie houses, of course, were built. And each one of them was an event, the big event of the city. My brother-in-law bought a home on 17th and Boulder, which was built by a man named Fred Letcher. Fred Letcher had gone broke several times. There's one difference between going broke in Oklahoma and going broke in New York. When you go broke in New York, you're really broke and you never have a chance to recover. But Fred Letcher, after he sold his home to my brother-in-law because he needed the money to get started again, made another fortune, and was very prosperous from then on in the oil business. The big homes that were built on Cheyenne and Carson by the Markham family, the Sinclair homes, were really the palaces of that period in the history of Tulsa. The Cosden home, and the Cosden building downtown, which later the building became known as the Mid-Continent building. Our first home was built in 1916, and it was built between, and I say our first home, my wife Millicent's and mine. We called it the honeymoon cottage, and it was built between 17th and 18th Street, and at 1712 South Boulder. It was a beautiful little home, and then years later, it was occupied by the Oral Roberts organization. When I came there to talk to them about the importance of helping us to establish a library, a real library system for Tulsa, Oral Roberts had invited all of the clergy in town to listen to a description of what we had in mind creating. And I said to them, I feel very much at home here because I am standing right above the site of a home that we first built in Tulsa in 1916. The trolley car ran just to 18th Street, and beyond that were farmhouses and farmland. Nothing existed. Owens Park, which was on the north side of town, named after our Senator Robert Owens, was the only park we had in town, and the only park that was paved. And we used to take friends who would visit us in Tulsa and drive them around to Owen Park and just keep making the circle. And at night you really couldn't tell where you were going places or backtracking on yourself. I became interested in a company called the Commonwealth Company in later years, and it was the first company to build very large homes in Maple Ridge and Sunset Park. Sunset Park is a development that is south of 21st Street, runs to 24th Street south, and runs from Cincinnati to Peoria. And my father, of blessed memory, put that district on. It was really the first high-class district to be built in Tulsa, and had these serpentine streets and very fine homes built there. He himself built a magnificent home on 24th Street and Woodward Boulevard.
Is it still standing?
It's still standing, and it cost him $175,000. And my two brother-in-laws built homes adjacent to him. I lived in a home at 21st and Norfolk, which was in Maple Ridge, and I think it had 17 rooms in it. It's interesting that one of the things that impressed me was that we had an Indian maid, and we had a great niece of Kit Carson, who was a nurse for my children. And I thought how strange it was that here was a native of the United States, or Oklahoma, who found it necessary to act in that capacity as an Indian maid. And the great Kit Carson's great niece had to resort to taking a position as nurse in a private home in order to maintain herself. They both stayed with us until they died. Yes. When I first came to Tulsa, I was sent to Clarence Douglas was the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce, and he asked me to attend a convention in Washington of the Chamber of Commerce there. The only thing I remember about that trip to Washington was that the speaker referred to a president of the United States that he had helped elect, and one of his friends asked him how he could criticize this man so severely after he had supported him for the position. And he said, well, it reminds him of a little saying that he heard. It states that the things have come to a hell of a pass if you can't wallop your own jackass. And that's the only thing I remember. But I also remember falling in love with the museums and the various monuments that existed then, and the Smithsonian Institute, and spending hours there with Mrs. Aaronson, who felt exactly the same as I did about those great institutions. As a matter of fact, I should say at the outset that she has been an inspiration to me all my life, and has really prodded me into doing practically everything I have done of any consequence in my lifetime. And I'm eternally grateful to her for it. The next thing I remember in Tulsa that involved my interest and a good deal of my time was the development of Spavinaw water for the city of Tulsa. Charlie Page, who owned one of the important newspapers at that time, the Tribune, lived in Sand Springs, and he thought, and his engineers told him, that Shell Creek and Shell Lake was a sufficient body of water to furnish good drinking water and for the city of Tulsa, and take care of its requirements in that regard. And
was Tulsa growing very fast at this
growing very fast, and we knew that the information he had was erroneous, but it developed into a very bitter fight. And I recall trips to Spavinaw where my car was stuck in the mud because we were trying to understand what the engineers were telling us of the tremendous supply of water that we could tap by going to Spavinaw, which is in the foothills of the Ozark Mountains. And what a wonderful thing it would be if we went that route rather than just temporarily take care of our requirements by going to Shell Creek. But of course, you belong, when you live in a small town of this kind, you belong to every civic organization. You're a member of the Chamber of Commerce, which I have been practically from the time I came to Tulsa until the present time. And you involve yourself in many different things, many different businesses. And many different civic activities. But frankly, as much as I did involve myself in these things, they did not interfere with my business enterprises and the things that I concerned myself with seriously.
Were you still in oil?
Still in oil. I became involved in a coal company, in the building of homes, as I think I've stated, and in real estate. And during the Depression, the Great Depression, the real estate we had was of absolutely no account as far as taking care of our requirements. And we all practically went broke. I owed more money than I owned property. And I had to find a way of making a living. And the way I did this was to represent chain store companies in finding locations for themselves, for their businesses. And one of the companies I represented was the Walgreen Company, the Walgreen Duck Stores. And I had the territory from west of the Mississippi all the way to the coast of California. And that was the way I made a living and got started back again into various enterprises in Tulsa. I didn't become serious about devoting most of my time to civic enterprises until one day, having returned from Hawaii with Mrs. Aaronson, we read in the paper that we were about to lose the Gilcrease Museum. This was a museum that located north of town that we had visited before and thought contained many great art objects.
What was the origin of the Gilcrease Museum?
Tom Gilcrease, who was a Pot Creek Indian, obtained a 160-acre allotment from the government because of his Indian heritage. And he was one of 10 children. But his 160 acres was right in the middle of the Glenpool oil field. And before he reached his majority, he was worth $1 million by virtue of owning this property. Well, he had difficulty holding on to the property, but he was able to do that, and it became the basis of a very substantial fortune. And as he grew older, he traveled around the world, and he met a man from North Carolina, a man by the name of Humber, H-O-M-B-E-R, who was a Rhodes Scholar and a very fine individual. And Dr. Humber gave him the desire to collect Western art and Americana and make that a project of a lifetime, which he did. And that all these treasures, the paintings, some 4,000 paintings, artifacts from Central and South America, Tarascan and Totemic and Aztec and Mayan items that today you can't take out of those countries. And he had thousands of those items that he collected and brought to Tulsa. And also a library made up of books and manuscripts, just with tremendous interest and value. In other words, Gilcrease now has the only known copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation signed by Franklin and Dean, known to exist. The original being in the Library of Congress.
How did it get in trouble then? How did it find
Well,
in trouble?
this man had an insatiable desire to collect. He was a collector. And they started to prorate the amount of oil you could sell, so that he overbought, and his income wasn't enough to permit him to pay for the obligations that he took on. And he realized that if he didn't buy, he'd never be able to obtain these items again. He was a very shrewd buyer, had wonderful taste, and knew what was good. And he obtained these magnificent holdings at a fraction of what they were really worth. So that and his income wasn't enough to permit him to pay for the obligations that he took on. And he realized that if he didn't buy, he'd never be able to obtain these items again. He was a very shrewd buyer, had wonderful taste, and knew what was good. And he obtained these magnificent holdings at a fraction of what they were really worth. So that when you added it all up, he overbought to the extent of $2.25 million, and the interest on that indebtedness was such that it practically broke him. But we had come back from Hawaii, and I said, let's take another look at this thing, which we did. And for the first time, I noticed a dapper-looking man watching the crowds going through his museum. And I said to my wife, Millicent, that must be Mr. Gilcrease. I'm going over to introduce myself to him, which I did. And I asked him, I said, Mr. Gilcrease, is it true that we are about to lose your wonderful collection, and it's going to leave Tulsa, possibly Oklahoma, possibly be broken up? And he says, yes, it's all very true. He said, I owe this a great deal of money that I haven't been able to pay because of the fact that of conditions where I can't sell my oil as I have been able to sell in the past. And the governor of Oklahoma has spent an entire year trying to find a solution, and without success. And my creditors are about to close in on me. And I spontaneously said to him, well, Mr. Gilcrease, I don't consider myself a wealthy man, but really, I would give a check of $1,000 without any hesitation, just to keep this collection in Tulsa. This is a wonderful thing for Tulsa, and I hate to see it leave Tulsa. Well, he said, I'm afraid it's too late. Mr. Aaronson, he said, it's just past the point where I feel we can save it. And that was our conversation. And as I left him, I talked to several other people, and I said to them, I told them what I had said to Mr. Gilcrease. And they said, well, we would give. One said, I'll give 500 if we could save it, and then another party said he'd give 1,000 if it could be saved. And it seemed to me, I didn't understand why, with that kind of response and with the kind of collection that existed, why it wouldn't be possible for the city of Tulsa to vote a bond issue to pay this indebtedness and come in possession of these wonderful treasures. And on the way home, I said to my wife, Millicent, let's invite some people up to the house, talk about this thing, and suggest a bond issue as a means of keeping the collection. I was quite naive at the time. I didn't realize that practically everything had been tried locally that could be tried, that the feeling in the city in high places especially, was such that no one thought there was a Chinaman's chance of accomplishing anything of this kind. It reminds me of the story that used to be in the retail gasoline business. We had these super stations in Tulsa and in several other cities. And we had managers in charge of each of the units, and we developed that one of our units required a manager, and we had nobody to promote who was capable of taking over. So we went into another industry and picked somebody who was not familiar with gasoline, but who was familiar with management, and put him in charge of this unit. Now, we sold seat covers as part of the things that we sold outside of gasoline and oil. And everybody knew, or we knew certainly, that you don't sell seat covers in the wintertime. You only sell them in the spring, and the fall, and the summer. And after this man took charge, here in the dead of winter, we were getting orders for seat covers. He didn't know you weren't supposed to sell them in the summer, in the wintertime. And so he kept sending in orders, and substantial orders, for seat covers. And we went down to investigate, and we found out that the dumb guy didn't really know you're not supposed to sell them, and he was selling them. So it just changed our whole program, of course, in selling of seat covers. And here I was making suggestions as to how to find a solution to a problem that had been kicked around in Tulsa for several years. And everything had been tried, including going to the Chamber of Commerce and asking their cooperation, and having a fight develop between the then chairman or president of the chamber and Mr. Gilcrease, so that it became impossible for them to have anything to do with the problem. But we called these people to our home. We called the managing editor of the Tulsa Tribune, a man by the name of Victor Barnett, and we called one of the very important men of the Tulsa World, Sid Steen. And I called a man by the name of Morton Harrison, who apparently had done a great deal of work. I'd never met this man before in my life, in trying to help Mr. Gilcrease find a solution to his problem. Morton Harrison was part Cherokee Indian and had great sympathy for what this man was trying, what Mr. Gilcrease was trying to do. And I called a man that at that time was my attorney, Mr. David Milston, because I felt maybe some legal advice would be necessary. And several other people I had spoken to at the museum that seemed to show an interest in it. And we met at our home, and I suggested the bond issue as a means, keeping the collection here. And Victor Barnett of the Tribune spoke up, and he says, well, now, Alfred, you can do this. You really could put a bond issue over it, but I'll tell you what it means. It means you're going to have to talk to every club in town. It means you're going to have to organize this thing. It means you're going to, it's a full-time job. And you're going to have to write letters, and you're going to have to make statements in the papers, and you're going to have to encourage the interest of people in this project. And I turned to my wife and I said, honey, this isn't for me. I never made a speech in my life. Let's forget about it. And just about that time, Mr. Harrison spoke up. He said, well, Mr. Aaronson, it won't be necessary. We have a deal all worked out where we're going to move this museum next to the Will Rogers Memorial. And the state of Oklahoma is going to take it over. He said, I'm glad it won't be important, necessary to bother you about this thing. But he said, you said to Mr. Gilcrease that you would give $1,000. Will you loan $1,000 to Mr. Gilcrease? He's at that point where he needs every dollar he can get a hold of to keep the creditors from crowding in on him. And I said, yes, I'll do that. And I wrote a check for $1,000, which I afterwards received back, and we were able to accomplish a solution of that problem. I just forgot about the matter, and then until 60 days after that meeting in my home, Mr. Harrison called me up and he said, we can't sell the idea of moving Gilcrease to Claremont. The legislature will buy it. And we've exhausted every single channel we know of. There's no way of finding a solution to this problem that we are able to discover. If you have any ideas, would you mind putting them into effect? I said, well, I have one idea I can tell you right now over the phone. And that is a friend of mine who is the chairman of the auditorium committee for the building of an auditorium in our Civic Center. And I could go to him, I think, and ask him to make this a part of his development. Add enough money to take care of this collection, and we'll move it downtown. He said, would you please try it out? And I said, I'd be happy to. I called this friend up and asked him about it, and he said, write me a letter and tell me what it's all about and what this collection contains and why you feel it's a good thing for Tulsa to have it and what you want us to do. Well, this is the first time I really had to sit down and research the entire situation in order to write an intelligent letter. And I told Victor Barnett what this friend had suggested I do. And he said, when you get that letter written, bring it over to me. And he said, I've got an idea. We'll run it as a headline in the paper and see how much reaction we get. Well, I finished the letter, and before I gave it to this friend, the chairman of the auditorium committee, I showed it to Mr. Barnett. He made very few corrections. He thought the letter was all right. And as he was reading it, I said, Victor, I think it would be a good idea if I obtained the signatures of others on the same letter with me. And then when you when you publish the letter, you might say that I would like to have others join me in signing a letter to this chairman, asking him to include it. Now, what would you think of that? And he said, I think it would be marvelous. So he said, let's take an extra week and you get those signatures, and which I did. The merchants in town, various people of importance I felt would help. I gave the letter to the chairman of this committee. And I hesitate to give his name because he afterwards told me that he would have nothing to do with the project. He knew the prior history of what had taken place in town, which I did not know. And he said, I just don't want it to hurt on my deal, and I don't want to have anything to do with it. The result of it was that Mr. Barnett ran this article asking people to join me as chairman of the Keep Gilcrease Collection or Museum in Tulsa Committee. And they had the committee was made up of these other signatures that we had obtained. And the result of that article, I received several thousand signatures and letters from all over the city imploring me to really work on this thing and try to keep this wonderful collection in Tulsa. And it inspired me to give it the time it required. And before I knew it, I was embroiled in an operation the like of which I have never undertaken in my life. And that was not only interesting, but so very rewarding. And but the first thing that appeared to me that we had to do to relieve the situation was to try to obtain a $500,000 loan from one of the banks in town. And while the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, who at that time was Mr. Okla Jones, could not officially support the program of a bond issue or take an active part in the program, in that development, he nevertheless personally gave me a tremendous assistance in helping me reach certain individuals who were very important. And one of those individuals was the president of a bank to whom I made the application, went to see in order to obtain this $500,000 loan. And he said to me, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I will call a special meeting of the board of directors of this bank. But first, I want you to obtain a written proposal from Mr. Gilcrease asking for the loan. I want a certified public accountant's statement of everything this man owns and everything he owes. And with this application, I will present it to a special meeting called just for the purpose of deciding whether we'll make a $500,000 loan." Well, we presented the statement, certified public accountant statement of what this man owed and what he owned. Well, as I recall the figures, he owned some $880,000 to the Republic National Bank of Dallas. He owned the Gilcrease Oil Company, which his family, this was what his, all of the assets that his sons and his daughter owned was a stock he gave them in this Gilcrease Oil Company, which and he owed them $430,000. He owed the National Bank of Tulsa approximately $120,000. And the Fourth National Bank about $115,000. He owned Nodler and he owned the Nodler and Company, the art dealers in New York City, $186,000. They were crying for their money. He owed Rosenbach, the great book collectors, and where he bought his manuscripts. He owed them $199,000. He had borrowed from local people that I didn't know anything about it when I got into this thing. He owed them $35,000. And he had notes from local people, $40,000. And then other art dealers, $186,000. Now, he showed assets. He showed tremendous assets. At that time, he showed assets of $9.5 million, which included his life insurance, his real estate. Everything he owned was hocked to some institution for the money that he had obtained in order to keep buying, in order to complete the collection that he had set out to create. So that when we went to this bank, we said, for this $500,000, we're giving you $7.5 million worth of assets to make sure of that loan. Well, the letter was signed by Mr. Gilcrease and asking for the loan of $500,000. The statement was prepared. The meeting for the bank was called, and I waited on pins and needles for the result to find out, would they make this loan? So I'd have something to go to the creditors with. And not having heard from him late on a Friday afternoon, I called him up. I said, well, what's the verdict? He said, we've turned it down. And I said, well, how many turned it down? How many voted for it and how many against it? He says they all voted against it. And they're betting 10 to 1 that if you ever have a bond issue, it will be defeated by overwhelming odds. I said, I'm coming over to see you. He said, well, you can come over. I'm writing you a letter, which you will have. I'm giving you my reasons for turning it down. But he said, if you want to, come over. So I came over. And I talked to him. I said, how can we make this loan? Got to make it. There's only one way we can see that you can make this loan. If you will give us these securities and stud horse notes for $750,000 against a $500,000 loan signed by people who will sign these notes. He said, we'll make the loan because we will not foreclose against the collection. There's too much public sentiment in that. We will foreclose against the notes. So your people who sign the notes will have the collection as security.
They really were vulnerable then, weren't they?
So I said to him, well, I can't see any possibility of accomplishing that, but I'll work on it because I think this is a tremendously important thing for the city. And I remember going back the next Monday and telling Jane Jones of the Tribune of the conversation and asking him his advice as to what we might do. Now, the Tribune gave me every cooperation in this deal. I mean, I'm so grateful to them for what they did. Mr. Barnett spent hours with me, tutoring me and telling me the things that I might do in order to accomplish what we were trying to complete. And I remember him saying, I'm afraid we've come to the end of the road. I said, I don't think we've come to the end of the road. You keep thinking about this, maybe some idea will suggest itself to you. But I said, and I went home that night pretty sick and almost agreed with him that we had come to the end of the road. And I talked with Okla Jones, and Okla Jones and I, in discussing this, came to the conclusion maybe we could get the then Mayor, L.C. Clark, to bring this bond issue out and let the people decide. And then we would call up every creditor and tell them what we intended to do. And say to them, you might as well come along with us because if you throw this thing into bankruptcy, goodness knows when you'll get your money. And it'll just make impossible a relatively quick solution of the problem, because if the bond issue is successful, you get your money in full. And if it isn't successful, you certainly get the property back, which you're so anxious to get. It's worth more than what he paid you for it. And that's exactly what happened. I went to L.C. Clark, and he made one condition. He agreed, he and his commissioners agreed to hold this election, and as a separate and private collection. We didn't want it added on to anything else. This was the issue. Shall we or shall we not save the Gilcrease collection for Tulsa? And on condition, he said that you will guarantee the cost of the election. We haven't any money to hold collections. He said, you should be able to collect that from people around the city. And I asked how much was involved. And he said he thought approximately $12,000. And he said, I want you to agree that this will be done before we can proceed. You haven't got the money. And so I agreed. And we then developed a campaign to see how many people would come in and help us in the program of paying for the election and giving the people of Tulsa an opportunity to vote on the issue. We did all the things that Mr. Barnett said we would have to do. We talked to the service clubs, and we talked to the various organizations in town. We answered letters, and we developed circulars, and we did everything that you could possibly do to encourage the interest of the people. And we were fortunate. We were just lucky in that they did vote 3-1 in favor of saving it. And today, the Business Week, for example, just very recently, ran an article on the value of Western art, and said that experts value the Gilcrease collection in Tulsa of Western art and Americana at anywhere from $27 to $100 million. And we ourselves, we who are part of the executive committee and the directorate of Gilcrease, of the Gilcrease Institute of American History and Art, say it has a value of at least $50 million. It is really, I think, the great cultural asset for this, not only the city of Tulsa, but the state of Oklahoma and probably the Southwest. It is a tremendous thing, and we're very fortunate in being able to save it. My experience with the Gilcrease situation was so rewarding in that it made so many friends and gave me so many interests that previously I had no opportunity to enjoy. That I really decided that it was important for me to develop my future program in life in such a manner that I would have time to devote to other situations that I knew were so important in the growth and development of this wonderful city of Tulsa and the wonderful people of Tulsa. So I reached a point in life where I was able to, felt that I had accumulated enough to take care of my family and to help in the education of my children and grandchildren. And that it was more important for me to find time to continue these interests which gave me so much pleasure and so much happiness and so many wonderful associations. So I decided to retire from active business. It has been said that if a man could see all of the dangers and the difficulties that he would encounter in his lifetime, regardless of how brave he was, he'd die of fright. And frankly, looking back, if I could have seen the amount that I would be giving up in order to devote my time to these civic projects, I'm not able to answer entirely whether I would have had the fortitude and willingness to take this path. However, I think I would, because I feel I have been so completely compensated for anything that I've done, and certainly I have not. Wanted for anything. Our tastes are simple, and I have great respect, and I think I appreciate so much the things that W.K. Warren has been able to do in Tulsa, for example, in building a $25 or $50 million hospital complex, and other people have been able to do. Tulsa's great because these people have given their substance to the city. But, and I'm not able to do that sort of thing. And I wonder which way you help the most, frankly. But I have no regrets, and as I say, and I'm happy that I was able to do this. So that after I had determined to retire in 1957, Mayor Maxwell, who was the then mayor of Tulsa, asked me to serve on the Tulsa Metropolitan Area Planning Commission. And I told him I'd think about it. I was on vacation, and when I came back, I would discuss it with him. And when I came back, I found a big announcement in the paper that I had been appointed to the Tulsa Metropolitan Area Planning Commission. And almost immediately, the chairman of that commission, Mr. Ed Doobie, created a committee known as the Downtown Tulsa Business Committee and asked me to take on the chairmanship of that committee. Tulsa, like all other cities, was suffering in their downtown area from a lack of planning and a deterioration of what was taking place downtown. And the whole structure of cities was changing, and outside areas were being developed rather than the concentration of all commercial activity in the downtown area of the city. The downtown area of the city was responsible for approximately 20% of the taxes that were being collected. And if you permitted that to deteriorate to a point where they could not assume their fair share, then each individual householder would have to increase the amount they paid as tax. All commercial activity in the downtown area of the city. The downtown area of the city was responsible for approximately 20% of the taxes that were being collected. And if you permitted that to deteriorate to a point where they could not assume their fair share, then each individual householder would have to increase the amount they paid as taxes. So it was important for everybody in the city to see downtown Tulsa develop. And we had many things that had to be corrected. The development of our Civic Center was in controversy in that some people felt that Fifth Street should be closed at Denver, and that the Civic Center should be developed as a homogeneous development and not have streets through it. Others felt that there should be tunnels under it, and others felt that the street should be left open. And the position we took was that Fifth Street should be closed. There was a tremendous fight. And if you asked me what was the most important thing that was done in the redevelopment of downtown Tulsa, I would, without hesitancy, say to you the closing of Fifth Street. It was a tremendous fight. The courts, it was in the courts, and fortunately we were successful in closing that street. That immediately, another thing that was very bad with Tulsa was that our whole library system here was archaic, and it was in very bad condition. And the city was not able to give the library system the money it required in order to create the system that the citizens of the city deserved. The city had entered into an agreement with the county to lease the old courthouse for library purposes. And it was completely unsuitable for that purpose. And they had a 99-year lease, the city did, with the county, and had promised to give library service to the entire county because the county gave them that lease. It was an impractical, unfortunate agreement to begin with. And the city and county at that time in the history of Tulsa weren't even able to sit down together to discuss the matter. They each went their separate ways, and so that any solution of the problem looked like it was impossible. It was completely tangled. But, and as a matter of fact, in the closing of Fifth Street, the county commissioners publicly announced they operated the courthouse in the Civic Center, the new courthouse, which and the county offices, which was open, one of the first structures built in the Civic Center. And they publicly announced that they were against closing Fifth Street. We had that to contend with, too. So it was really a terribly involved and unfortunate situation. And what we did was we developed a series of luncheon meetings between the important commissioners, both in the city and the county, and explained how vital a solution of the problem was. And the result of it was, and we had to figure some way of canceling the lease between the city and the county. And that was one of the first things that this Downtown Business District Committee accomplished. We killed that old lease, which left the courthouse in the possession of the county, and then we recommend the county that we tear down that building and use it for a parking lot, get some revenue, and then once you tear it down, that some other development will take place. Well, some other development did take place. They did tear it down. It was used for a parking lot, and it did bring in $2,500 a month during the period that it was used. It ceased to be an eyesore and a refuge for the birds, and it really kept development from taking place in that entire area. So that when that lease was canceled, and then today, development took place, and today, you know, the tallest building in town, the 32-story Fourth National Bank, is on that corner of the old courthouse. At the same time, when we brought the bond issue to the attention of the people of Tulsa for a new library system, it was defeated, and defeated badly, because most people felt that how could you tear down such a magnificent structure as the old courthouse, and anybody who is so wantonly wasteful as to do a thing like that should not be charged with the responsibility of developing a library system. A year later, we brought the issue again to their attention, and fortunately were successful. But we had to have, we knew that neither the city nor the county had the funds to support a library system. And what we first had to have was an enabling act in the state which permitted us to tax property a minimum of 1 mil, a maximum of 2 mils for the operation of libraries. And that just skimmed through by the skin of a tear, by a very, very small margin, but it was successful, thank God. And then we brought this issue again to the attention of the people, $3,800,000 bond issue for the building of a library system. And fortunately, that also was successful. And when we built the Central Library building in the Civic Center, we were worried about the amount of money we had being able to take care of all of the improvements we felt should be included in the development. And so we had 13 alternates. Fortunately, we didn't have to resort to any single one of them, and we had everything that we originally contemplated should be in the library. And that library bond issue and that library campaign was a most interesting development, and turned out to be, and has since developed to be, one of the finest systems, not only in Tulsa and Oklahoma, but in the entire...
It's known all over the...
Yes, it's really...
It's recognized all over the nation.
All over the nation. It's really, it's a tremendous thing. And a good deal of that credit is done to the people who helped design it. We did go out of town for consultants, but a good deal of that credit is due to a woman that was in the system and who I recognized had extraordinary ability. She was the woman in charge of the branch libraries and bookmobiles. And after watching the way she operated and the type of individual she was, the commission decided that she should be put in charge of the whole system. Allie Beth Martin. She's a remarkable person. She's still the librarian in charge. She's still the director of the whole system. And she has done a magnificent job, and I can't praise her too much. And I hope that we'll be wise enough to keep her here and have her continue her efforts in this regard. Many things happened during this entire period. One of them that I remember particularly was the development of a psychiatric building for a psychiatric foundation was created by a man who was Herman Taubman, who felt that Tulsa needed this facility and was willing to put in a considerable amount of money to get it going. And Mr. Taubman had committed himself with certain architects in town, and the project was pretty much underway. Decided that this firm of architects should not be charged with the responsibility for the completion of the project. So he came to me. He asked me if I would accept the chairman, and he told me what the problem was. He asked me if I would accept the chairmanship of the building committee. And I said, I'm so involved with other things, I wish you wouldn't bother me. But then he explained that he wouldn't involve me, but he felt that I knew him better than anybody else, and I knew what he was trying to accomplish, and that he could work with me, and that we should be able to find a solution and change architects and go ahead with the project. The result was that I did accept that responsibility and arranged with the architects to take in an additional firm to work with them in this development. And then this firm bought the original architects out so that we corrected the condition and we were able to complete that structure, which is...
Is this privately owned?
Yes, no, it's a Indian mercenary organization that operates it for the benefit of the city, and it's one of the great institutions of the city, and I'm very happy I had something to do with it. But this has been such I haven't touched on human relations, and I think it's important that we say something in that regard. It became, after the decision of the Earl Warren decision in the Brown case, as you remember, it became very apparent that a change was taking place in this country for every man, regardless of race, color, or creed, would be given an opportunity to get, or should be given an opportunity to get a decent education, be considered a human being, an opportunity to equal facilities, open accommodations everywhere. And a revolution actually was taking place. Just recently, Earl Warren, in fact, last year, 1970, talked about the crisis in American justice. And he said, "We've had many crises in prior years, but none within the memory of living Americans which compares with this crisis. A number of factors contribute to it: war, inflation, unemployment, with resulting poverty, a deterioration of our environment, an atmosphere of repression, and a divisiveness in our society to a degree of intensity that has not been equaled in the past 100 years. There are many causes for this crisis," Mr. Warren said, "but none as basic as our neglect in reaching the ideal we fashioned for ourselves in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Another is our failure to enforce adequately the first section of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which reads, 'All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States, and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privilege or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.'" This has been our problem. This has been what we have been concerned with in this country for many years. And when the matter was discussed in Tulsa about open accommodations for all people, I was a member. The Mayor Jim Maxwell, appointed me as a member of the Community Relations Commission. As a matter of fact, several of us came to the mayor and said, "You should have such a commission." And he followed our advice and created this commission. And we tried to get the merchants in town, and the restaurants in town, the hotels in town, to voluntarily open their facilities, but without success. And so that we finally had an ordinance passed, which made it mandatory for them to give service to everybody. And I can remember one incident where one restaurant man, after we had the ordinance, just simply refused to serve Negroes. And I said to him, supposing a couple of soldiers who just came out of Vietnam, returning to Tulsa, fighting for you, fighting for all of us, would come into your restaurant and ask for service. Would you refuse those boys service in your restaurant? And one of the men who had brought a complaint against this restaurant said, "Mister, we just came back from Vietnam." So you had that kind of a situation to contend with. So I concerned myself with the human relations problems because I felt it was something that we just had to do. And Governor Bellman, when he asked me to serve on the Human Rights Commission, the state Human Rights Commission, I told him I'd be happy to serve in that regard. And when I retired, made me an honorary member of that commission. And then, during that period, the Southwest Center of Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma had been formed. And the way that was formed was by a friend of mine, a man by the name of Syl Goldman of Oklahoma City, who gave the University of Oklahoma $40,000 as seed money to develop this organization. And I was asked to serve on the executive committee of the Southwest Center. And they have been really the inspiration to so many wonderful things that have happened in Oklahoma. Well, serving on the Community Relations Commission, the Human Rights Commission, the Southwest Center, gave one an opportunity to see the whole picture and realize its importance and how important it was that good human relations exist in every community. Because if you don't have good human relations, you're really building on sand, and the structure will not continue to exist.
Well, Mr. Aaronson, with people like you, there couldn't be anything but good human relations in Tulsa.
Well, you're very kind to say that, but I want to make something very, very clear. There are very wonderful people living here. And the cooperation that they have given to all of the projects that I've concerned myself with, I just can't praise them enough or thank them enough for that cooperation. Tulsa basically has a fine population. I feel that way about Oklahoma, too. And I think we have a tremendous and great future ahead of us. I've always been concerned about our cultural advantages and our human relation advantages, keeping pace with our commercial and industrial development. I feel that they will. We've had many disappointments that we all can point to, but maybe we're a little too hasty in our judgments. I think basically people are decent. I think they're fine. I'm an optimist, and I have great hopes for the future of this state and this country.
Oh, you're wonderful. Thank you so very much.